So this conversation isn't going away. I guess I don't know why I expected it to, because it's a great muse for people on the left and Democrats in general to really pound Donald Trump on this story. And to be clear, anyone watching this particular clip in this particular segment, I think Donald Trump is the pile of dog shit that I walked through earlier today and had to clean my shoes. That's what I think of Donald Trump as. However, even a pile of dog shit can actually be right. I'm not going to disregard his message just because the messenger is a buffoon. Donald Trump was right. He was not genuine. He was disingenuous. He was not even speaking to a black audience. He was talking about black people in front of white people, kind of as for the purposes of coddling his white audience who feels like he may be too bigoted. And so they're like, oh, now they can hear him say, oh, Donald Trump cares about black people, right? So he's not genuinely concerned about the black community, nor does he have plans to actually help the black community economically or any community economically. However, that does not change the substance of his message, which is the economic condition of black people in America is utterly atrocious. We are in a really bad position economically as African Americans, and we have this knee-jerk reaction where we reject it, number one, because anybody said it. Anybody, right? It's almost like you can't talk about family unless you're family. So we barely want to hear black people say this, let alone want to hear somebody like Donald Trump say this. But, you know, the important thing to realize is just like the last caller said, right? This is a legitimate problem. And actually, I want to pull some data up on the screen for you to talk about the condition that the black community actually is in, and in the broader context of the election in general. Actually, I want to start with the results from a Pew poll that says more black voters than white voters view rich-poor gap as a very big problem. So the gap between and asking all voters, here's the question: the gap between the rich and poor, what is a very big problem? Here are your choices. The gap between the rich and poor, all voters say 52% of all voters say that this is a problem. 47% say that the gap between the rich and the poor are a problem. 55% of Hispanic people say that the gap between rich and poor is a problem. 77% of African Americans, of black Americans, say that the gap between the rich and poor is a problem. The only thing close to that problem that we believe is not terrorism. We don't think terrorism. Well, 54% of us think that terrorism is a big problem. 41% of us, 28% of us believe that immigration is a problem. You know, the only thing that compares really is crime. 68% of African Americans believe crime is a major problem. And then the next closest one is relations between racial and ethnic groups. Do we believe that that's a big problem? 61% of us believe that race is a problem. 68% of us believe that crime is a problem, but 77% of us believe that the gap between the rich and the poor is a problem. That is far more accurate of an assessment of the black community than any pundit you have heard on mainstream media, who is utterly rejecting this notion from Donald Trump. Matter of fact, that is an opening for Donald Trump if Donald Trump wasn't Donald Trump, right? I like what Eddie Glaude said this morning on Morning Joe. He was like, Donald Trump is already disqualified, right? And I said this last week, right? If this message was coming from anybody else other than Donald Trump, this message would resonate with those 77% of African Americans who believe that the gap between rich and poor is a major problem, is a big problem. But Donald Trump being Donald Trump, he has already eliminated himself. He's already disqualified. Now, with Donald Trump already being disqualified, it does not change the fact that African Americans view this gap as now. The reason I bring this up in particular before I even start the conversation on black wealth is because of the opportunity that genuinely represents for someone like Bernie Sanders. On this side of the primary, when you see 77% of black people have a problem or believe that the gap between the wealthy and the poor is a major problem, you see that Bernie Sanders' message would have resonated tremendously in the black community. And I guarantee you, Hillary Clinton's internal polling showed her that, which is why she rolled out the black firewall like nothing we have ever seen in our adult lives. Because how else can you fight back against a community who knows from experience that there is a inequality problem in America, not just a racial inequality, but an economic inequality in America? How else can you fight back against that when the person you're running against has that exact message? Well, you get a bunch of black people who are doing pretty good for themselves, probably making about $250,000 a year, maybe $300,000 a year. You know, some of them might be actually be millionaires. You get them and you get them to say that that white guy over there has a problem with race and he doesn't understand race and he doesn't understand the black community and he doesn't understand this and he doesn't know how to talk to black people and he thinks all black people live in the ghetto. And so you distract us with this easy red meat of racial tension and make us easily forget, or not easily forget, but make sure that we never give somebody like Bernie Sanders a chance to have a conversation about economic inequality. Because that's ultimately what happened. It's not that we forgot that, it's not that the firewall was so potent that they made us forget about our economic struggles. It's that before we could even have a conversation about how we can change the systemic nature of poverty in America, they had already sandbagged Bernie Sanders. These same people are now on television right now telling you that there's nothing wrong in the black community. The black community is doing fine. And Donald Trump is painting this very negative picture of the black community when in actuality, it is a very desperate situation in the black community. I already gave you the stats last night, but I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of it. 27.4% of African Americans live beneath $24,000 a year, the poverty line. That poverty line is considered to be too low, so we generally use 2 times the poverty line, which we actually is not quite 2 times, but $45,000 a year. 50% of more than 50% of African Americans live below the 2 times the poverty line. 45% of African American youth grow up in poverty in the $24,000 or less bracket. We only have a 3.6% chance of moving out of the bottom percentile into the top percentile. The situation, I believe it was 62.7 or 62.9% of African Americans who are born in poverty stay in poverty, die in poverty. You want more data? Let's go. In the article in the research actually from discussing the ever-growing gap in wealth in the African-American community, it outlines the case that it's going to take 228 years for the average African-American family to get the amount of wealth that the average white family has today. Not for us to catch up, not for us to come into parity, but for an average African-American family to establish the amount of wealth that the average white family has right now, it would require 228 years. The Institute for Policy Studies, IPS, in conjunction with the Corporation for Economic Development, they released a study that said the racial wealth gap looked at the trends of household wealth between 1983 and 2013. And if you know 1983 was really the full rollout of Reaganomics. Actually, 1981 was when they signed the Roth-Kemp tax breaks, which really rolled out Reaganomics, which was a boom to the upper middle class, but created poverty like we've never seen, in conjunction with a lot of things that happened over that 30-year period. It took, here's a quote from it. It took over 400 years of slavery, segregation, and institutionalized discrimination in the labor and housing markets to build the wealth gap that we see today. If those trends persist for another 30 years, the average white family's net worth will grow by $18,000 per year, but black and Hispanic households would only see theirs grow by $750 and $2,250 per year, respectively. In other words, black families, while white families' wealth is growing at $18K a year, black families' wealth is growing at $750 a year. Since 1994, government spending on wealth building has more than tripled from $200 billion in 1994 to $660 billion last year. But 77% of those benefits go to households with annual incomes between $75,000 and $500,000. And as I already stated, the median income for African Americans is $35,000 a year. So we're nowhere near getting the opportunity that we could be getting. The median income for whites in 2011 was 50% higher than it was for blacks and Latinos, but white median household wealth was around 16 times greater. The Fair Housing Act of 1968, people of color missed out on decades of robust growth in housing markets, and much after that because it took 20 years to fully implement. This is, I think, the biggest takeaway. If you don't remember anything else that I just quoted from this study, I want you to remember this. The wealth of a child's family is the single greatest predictor of that child's future economic prospects. And this is from Dalton Conley. He's a Princeton University sociologist. This is something that they quoted in the study. This is, if you want to talk about systemic racism, I mean, we talk about systemic racism in terms of like microaggressions. I get seeing systemic racism and in policing practices, because that has a direct effect on so many. 1 in 4. I did not notice that until yesterday. 1 in 4 African American men will spend some time in jail. I only have 3 brothers. I guess if I had a fourth, the fourth brother would have been spending some time in jail. 1 in 4. So I get viewing racial justice, police brutality, profiling, racial profiling. I get that. But when you talk about structural problems, structural hindrances to the black community, you cannot talk about it unless you talk about the economics of it. And I say this from the perspective of the black community so much because I saw how much the black community was used as a muse to ignore this conversation in the primaries. We could be having this discussion right now, but instead we're talking about Donald Trump and his shenanigans and Hillary Clinton's emails. And no one, while 77% of African Americans are saying that they are interested and concerned about the gap between the rich and the poor, and they view it as a very big problem. 77% of African Americans are saying that. And what are we doing today instead? We're trying to convince the world that things are not as bad as what Donald Trump said in his speech. Just so you could visualize what this looks like. The top graph represents the income growth of the wealth, not income, I'm sorry, but the wealth growth of a white family. The middle line represents the growth in a Latino family, and the bottom line, the bottom curve, represents the growth in the African American family. Just so you could visualize the growth over time, beginning back in 1983. The midpoint is 2013. At the midpoint, you see the average wealth of a white family is around $656,000, and the average wealth of an African American family, $85,000. And that's, to me, that's the average. Hang on, let me be sure. That is the average. That is not the median. If we look at the median, and we'll see that it is dramatically different. This is calculating in Oprah Winfrey. You know, this is calculating in everybody, because you can't tell me that the average African American even has, and this is, of course, talking about their land, right? They're talking about their property. So I'm sure it's not as bleak as I feel as it is, if you're talking to their houses and everything else. But this is tremendously inflated by the presence of some outliers. So let's just say that. But if you look at the end of the curve, look at the growth over time. This is the most troubling, not where we are right now, but where it's going. In 2043, if it continues on this path, African Americans' wealth will only increase from 85,000 to 107,000, while white Americans' wealth will go from 656,000, basically double, to 1.2 million. You want to talk about income inequality? Look at this graphic. The 400 richest Americans own more wealth than the entire black population plus 1/3 of the Latino population combined. $2.34 trillion in wealth for the 400 top richest Americans, and 2.17 trillion in wealth for the entire black community. That's including Oprah. That's including, well, I was going to say 50 Cent, but 50 Cent is bankrupt now. That's including everybody, plus 1/3 of the Latino community. Now, truth be told, we can make some comparable, we could probably make some comparisons for like the, if you divide the white America up by class, you're going to probably see the top 400 have more wealth than maybe 20% of, I'm just throwing a number out there, right? So you can see this is not something that's only a problem for the black community. But I think it's important for us to point this out, because right now on television somewhere you have a Democrat-leaning black pundit who is attacking Donald Trump for being a dick, which he is, and dismissing the argument that we have an economic problem in the black community, which we do. And we know we do, based on the Pew research showing that 77% of us actually believe that that gap is problematic. So okay, enough with the data. Here's the deal. If we keep allowing people to dictate to us what should be our daily conversation, instead of us dictating for ourselves and for the people around us, dictating what is important to us, then we will always be chasing the rabbits that the mainstream media puts in front of us. And today that rabbit is, oh, Donald Trump says something insensitive to the black community, and now everybody is chasing after that. And we're just like on the sideline, people like me and Yvette Carnell, we're on the sideline like, yes, we're chasing that rabbit, but the truth of the matter is, yes, Donald Trump is an ass, but the truth of the matter is, this is a tremendous problem for the black community. And it's one that we cannot ignore. And if nobody, think about this. If nobody else is going to talk about it, Hillary Clinton's response to Donald Trump's comment was that this was exceedingly ignorant or staggeringly ignorant. But we need to talk about this, Hillary. We need to talk about this, whoever else, Charles Blow, on CNN. We need to talk about this, Bakari Sellers on CNN. We need to talk about the fact that the black community's wealth is non-existent. And I'm sorry, I know Donald Trump doesn't have a solution for us. I know Donald Trump is going to make it worse, but if he's the only one bringing it to the table for a conversation piece, then damn it, let him continue to bring it on the table so that we can talk about the causes of this and the solutions for this. And it's a shame. You guys got me on here defending Donald fucking Trump, as imbecilic as he is. But we cannot continue to swift boat ourselves. Because if we ever have this conversation, then I know there is so much solidarity between poor blacks, working class blacks, lower middle class blacks, and their comrades in the white community and the Latino community. the poor whites, impoverished whites, the working class Latinos. There's so much unity that could exist there if we did not allow the mainstream media to make us chase rabbits. And here's another thing, before you run off and say, oh, the poor white people are the ones that are racist that go to Donald Trump. Nope. I believe it was either the average or the median income of I'm not sure, because there's a big difference. So my fact checkers, go and check that. But it was either the average or the median income for a Donald Trump supporter is about $75,000 a year, which means the average Donald Trump supporter is doing better than the 50% of the African-American community. They are not the ones who are poor. We are. And so we have this image in our mind that all of Donald Trump supporters are these poor, toothless, Southern rednecks, when in reality, most of them are like Joe the plumber. They're independent contractors. They have a modest measure of wealth, and they're just aggravated because they realize how much taxes, how many dollars in taxes they have to pay. Right? Just because they dress like they're poor doesn't mean that they're poor. And so we have this image of white poverty, and we immediately associate it with racism, which probably there's some correlation through history. But at the end of the day, they are poor and broken by the same system that is breaking us, economically speaking. And as long as we keep chasing after the rabbits that the people in power give us, the mainstream media gives us, we're going to always be looking at this data and saying, damn. That's it. Damn. I don't even know what the fuck. Just damn.